Forward, Susan Stryker. Jolene Zagarovich's fascinating anthology, Transgothic in Literature and Culture, takes its place among a growing list of scholarly works that draw upon the insights from the interdisciplinary field of transgender studies to make significant contributions to areas of study that seem, on first blush, to have little to do with the lived lives of transgender-identified people. But just as feminisms of color in the 1980s developed the notion of a theory in the flesh that could articulate the complex intersectionalities of multiply marginalized lives in ways that produced formally legitimated knowledges, methodologies, and pedagogies of critical utility in a great many other contexts, so too has transgender studies become a way to interrogate previously unmarked dominant forms of gender and embodiment that otherwise would remain unremarked on and unproblematized. Given that atypical forms of embodiment, gender expression, identity, and desire are quite central to the field of Gothic studies, transgender studies is poised to offer that field an important methodological toolkit. Transgender studies, and trans theorizing more generally. Transgender studies and trans theorizing more generally makes a distinction between earlier studies of gender-variant phenomena, which are voluminous, and the new style of work that emerged in the early 1990s in the wake of Sandy Stone's post-transsexual manifesto. This new work imagined transgender subjects not merely as objects of knowledge studied and spoken of by others, but rather as speakers of discourse, scholarly experts, and autoethnographic subjects in their own right, who find themselves in conversation with any number of interlocutors. From the beginning, one principal thrust of the field has been to abstract critical insights from trans lives to intervene in contexts in which those lives have a stake, but in which they have typically had no voice. Over the decades, trans theory, like disability theory and feminist theory and critical race theory, has developed into an analytical framework through which to question the world. It is a framework that emerges from the problematics of living particular kinds of embodied specificities, but which is applicable not only to the study of such bodies, nor reducible to mere subjective reporting from the standpoints of those particular kinds of bodies. It is capable of a much more robust worlding. As Zagarovich points out in her introduction to this volume, transgender theory is admirably suited to the task of pursuing certain lines of research in Gothic studies. In a field that is bifurcated into scholarship on a generic Gothic, unmarked as masculine-centric, and a specifically minoritized women's Gothic, a body of theory that explicitly sets out to destabilize the gender binary will necessarily pose questions of foundational importance for our understanding what the Gothic entails. Some of the work necessary for unsettling the assumption of a gender binary has already been done by cultural theorists and literary scholars such as Eve Sedgwick, George Haggerty, and Ardell Hassel-Thomas, who have worked under the rubric of queer studies, but such queer work addresses a narrower range of bodily states, non-normative subjects, and discordant identities than fall under the broader category of trans. It too readily limits questions of somatic transformation or gender transposition to questions of deviant desire. While queer has certainly been the more privileged critical concept, trans has an additional interpretive capacity in that it can accommodate and account for representations of bodily transformations rooted in desire, while simultaneously facilitating our understanding of transformations that flow along other vectors and lines of flight. In Object Lessons, her study of interdisciplinary field formations, Robin Weijman criticizes narratives, such as the one offered by Gail Rubin in Thinking Sex, that explains the emergence of queer theory from the blind spots of feminist gender analysis, or my account of transgender studies as queer theory's evil twin, that seem to premise the development of new analytical frameworks as a temporal mode of emergence that requires, by its very logic, a claim to critical succession. But such a view confuses the recounting of a sequence of events unfolding over time with a teleological view as to why those events transpired in the order they did. Trans studies no more supplants queer theory than queer theory supplanted feminism, but it does do a different sort of work. Zagarovich's coinage of transgothic supplies an apt neologism for expressing this queer and other than queer critical capacity of transness. Even its word form signals its methodological difference from a queer Gothic. Whereas queer operates here as an adjective that modifies a pre-existing object, trans does not, cannot, stand alone. It is a prefixal attachment that requires being connected to something, a something that is ruptured and transformed in an act of drawing it across some limit or boundary, a something that becomes a something else. Whereas the queer Gothic is a Gothic we might recognize, approached askance, the transgothic is a Gothic undergoing transition from one status to another. Transgender studies is all the more pertinent for Gothic studies, given that the weird effects and vague horrors that characterize the Gothic as a literary genre are so frequently associated with instances of gender crossing and bodily transformation, which are quite central to the concerns of transgender theorizing. Furthermore, transgender studies has, since its inception a quarter-century ago, dwelt on questions and embraced perspectives familiar to any student of the Gothic. Stone's post-transsexual manifesto engages notions of the human and invites us to think about the relationship of gender dissonant status to human privilege, particularly as the human is modified or even displaced through such prefixal conceptual operations as the a and non-human, as well as the post. Judith Butler's discussion of the phantasmatic lesbian phallus in Bodies That Matter, arguably part of the trans studies canon, linked long-standing concerns in psychoanalytic theory and phenomenological philosophy with transgender themes of sex-gender mixing and transposition through a Gothic-friendly metaphorics of haunting. My own early contribution to the field, my words to Victor Frankenstein above the field of Chamonix, drew explicitly from Mary Shelley's famous novel to explore themes of unnaturalness and monstrosity, and couched its thoughts in a literary style intended to echo Gothic sensibilities. Jack Halberstam's Skin Shows, Gothic Horror and the Technology of Monsters explored similar themes at far greater depth and breadth, and represents perhaps the first major intervention of trans-inflected theorizing into the field of Gothic studies. Trans studies has been Gothic all along, it seems, and Gothic studies implicitly trans. Zagarevich and the authors she showcases in this volume take trans as a theoretical point of departure for reimagining what the Gothic can be, as well as a heuristic for letting us see retrospectively, in a new light, what it has already been. In my own research, I've begun exploring speculative fiction to investigate the question of when and how Anglo-American culture began imagining the ways in which new biomedical technologies, particularly hormones and genital surgeries, could affect a change of sex. These techniques for bodily transformation have surprisingly long histories, but began becoming more accessible and more widely employed in the late 19th, 1800s, and early 20th, 1900s centuries, precisely when new medical, juridical discourses of biological racism and scientific sexology were being promulgated. There are any number of works of fiction from this period that revolve around the biomedical manipulation of bodies in ways that blur species boundaries. H.G. Wells' Island of Dr. Moreau being one of the best remembered, or that evoke racialized notions of the human and subhuman, such as Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But remarkably, there are precious few such works that imagine biomedicalized sex change. Even in texts such as J.D. Bernal's 1929 The World, the Flesh, and the Devil, a serious work of technological prognostication, authored by one of the leading scientists of the mid-20th century, 1900s, which extrapolated from then-current knowledge to envision a time when disembodied human brains might be launched into outer space in robot rocket ships, it seemed easier to imagine unsexing, or even radical discorporation, than it did to imagine a resexing of the body. Equally remarkable is that the few sex change stories from this period were to be found not in hard science fiction that focused on the implications of emergent technologies, or even realist fiction that addressed the existing world, but rather in Gothic, horror, and weird fiction, such as Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, in which the offspring of a pagan deity and a human woman has the ability to transform shape, including sex, or in H.P. Lovecraft's stories of ancient aliens who can inhabit the bodies of humans at will, men and women alike. One of the most extensively elaborated such stories was Richard Marsh's decidedly Gothic The Beetle, from 1897, in which the novel's scientist-inventor-protagonist tangles with an entity worshipped in North Africa before the rise of the Egyptian civilization, who stalks the streets of London, shifting between female and male form, as well as between humanoid and insectoid. The earliest tale of surgical sex change I know of is Gregory Kasparian's An Anglo-American Alliance, a serio-comic romance and forecast of the future, illustrated and self-published by the author in 1906. The book draws as heavily on its Orientalist and Neo-Gothic predecessors as it does on new scientific ideas. The story revolves around Aurora Cunningham and Margaret MacDonald, two wealthy young women who meet and fall in love at boarding school. Separated from her beloved after Aurora returns to the UK after graduation, Margaret seeks the services of a mysterious doctor, Hyder Ben Rabba, in a quest to become a man so that she can wed her true love. Ben Rabba is an adept of yoga and Ayurvedic medicine who had also trained at the Royal College of Surgeons in London and who has established a practice as a vivisectionist and reincarnator somewhere in the nether reaches of Brooklyn. From within the confines of his secluded manor, hideous animal shrieks emanate each night, and we learn that Ben Rabba has been working toward the goal of sex transformation by the aid of science, occultism, and wonderful magic. The scene in which Ben Rabba reanimates Margaret as male perfectly captures the blend of weird affect and Gothic sensibility that characterizes the period's literary treatment of biomedical sex transformation. An awful sensation crept over one looking around about this den called the laboratory. Glittering saws and scalpels were hung in rows on the walls. Lances, beakers, and retorts were scattered on the tables and on the floor, and 101 other apparatus and bottles could be seen upon the shelves. With eyes dilated, eyebrows knit, and arms stretched, holding in one hand a magic wand, this future Mephisto uttered some mysterious words in sepulchral intonations, snapped his fingers 3 times, and presto, the spell was broken. The full magical effect of his audacious undertaking was evident, for scarcely had the last syllable of those mysterious and incomprehensible words left his shriveled lips, when a sudden tremor shook the frame of Margaret and, with a subdued groan, indicative more of a sensation of bliss than of pain, she opened her eyes. A triumphant smile pervaded her countenance, as if awakening from a utopian dream. The patient at once became conscious that her bodily transformation was complete, for it did not take her long to realize it as he stood there, a beautiful specimen of manhood. Barry Payne's An Exchange of Souls from 1911 similarly mixes the Gothic with the technological. Influenced by both spiritualism and theosophy, Payne's work tells the tale of Dr. Daniel Myas, who has invented a machine that allows the soul to transmigrate from one body to another at the moment of death, in a plot that involves a heterosexual couple sharing a moment of joint embodiment, with a denouement that conveys a sense of disquietude and perturbation at the commingling of male and female in a single body. Even as late as 1934, well after reports of medical sex change had begun to be circulated in the popular press, the commercially successful novelist and screenwriter Michael Arlen continued to foreground Gothic elements in Hell, Said the Duchess, his transgenre story about gender crossing, set in the near future, that combined supernatural horror with light social comedy, and narrative devices drawn from police procedurals and political thrillers. In Arlen's tale, Mary Dove, a decorous young society widow seemingly above reproach, is the apparent perpetrator of a string of grisly murders carried out by a female serial killer nicknamed Jane the Ripper. But in actuality, the crimes have been committed by an ancient demon named Exalo, who has gained the ability to assume her shape. In the climactic scene, as the demon in female form prepares to rape the male protagonist, Axelo taunts its intended victim. "La-di-da," she said, "so Pan and Ishtar have become one, have they? And Priapus and Venus? Well, maybe. The march of science, of course, is irresistible. But what kind of magic can it be, my love, that can change a man into a woman so desirous of love, and so capable, as you will find out, of fulfilling her desire?" As even this handful of examples suggest, it's not just that trans studies has something to offer Gothic studies. Understanding the Gothic as an aesthetic or effective mode of reception, through which publics have confronted the implications of new biomedical possibilities for bodily transformation, a foundational condition for contemporary notions of transgender identity, is likewise a vital task for trans studies. Jolene Zagarovich and the authors represented in this volume make a great start in bringing these two fields of study together in provocative and generative ways.